everyone to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. I'm Liz Cohen, I'm Dean of the Institute. I'm particularly pleased to welcome Harvard's president, Gilpin Faust, to join us at Radcliffe today for the opening of the Schlesinger Library's exhibition, What They Wrote, What They Saved, The Personal Civil War. This exhibition, like many other programs recently mounted across the country, marks the 150th anniversary of the nation's 4-year Civil War. But the Schlesinger's exhibition makes a unique contribution to these commemorations. The objects and documents selected from our collections demonstrate vividly that the domestic concerns of home and family were not detached from war. Rather, personal, often private documents provide compelling evidence of how the military and political events of the Civil War deeply affected the lives of individuals and of families. The Civil War was a domestic conflict in several senses of the word. Consider, for example, Abraham Lincoln's proclamation in the speech he made at the start of his Senate campaign in 1858, that, and I'm quoting here, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Lincoln was, of course, alluding to the increasingly contentious debates over slavery that flared as the United States expanded its domestic borders westward. But I think it's revealing that he chose the image of domestic collapse in warning of impending political crisis. Just 3 years later, the violent outbreak of the Civil War would destroy the nation's domestic unity once and for all. And the sacrifices of war would leave an indelible mark on the domestic lives of American families in the North and in the South. The Schlesinger Library's rich collections of family and household papers, letters, and diaries offer us moving glimpses into the profoundly personal impact of the war. We read tender and reassuring letters from fathers, brothers, and sons at the battlefield. We hear the weary and worried voices of mothers, daughters, and sisters who are left to soldier on at home without them. These personal documents express a wide range of emotions. Men worry about their wives and their children and long for home. Consider, for example, Royal Barry, a private in the 45th Massachusetts Regiment, who took time before tap sounded to write to his fiancée, Eleanor, and to draw for her a picture of his quarters in North Carolina. Other men, such as Henry Ward Beecher, wrestle with the conflict between patriotism and parenthood when sending their sons into battle. These letters and journals also show us the complexity of women's reactions to war. At times, women hide their apprehension from a family member serving in the Army, painting reassuring pictures of life on the home front. In more private moments, burdened by holding their households together alone, women confess their loneliness on the pages of their diaries. Mothers, including Harriet Beecher Stowe, wait anxiously for their sons to return home. Diaries and account books demonstrate how women responded to politics. We learn of Delaware-born Anne Dorsey Reed Reeves, whose pro-Confederate sympathies led her to move to an Arkansas plantation during the war. And for the first time in a Schlesinger exhibition, we get a glimpse into the recently acquired Ames family collection, which was perhaps the largest collection of multi-generational family papers in private hands until it was generously donated to the library in 2013. And among its treasures is the diary of abolitionist Kathryn Robbins, who wrote almost daily about the war from her house on Cambridge Street, just steps from here. Upon hearing news of the Emancipation Proclamation, she penned joyfully, and I quote her, "This is a day I never expected to live to see." The intensely emotional accounts of the Civil War that are showcased in this exhibition have reminded me of my own first serious work of history as an undergraduate at Princeton University. And this was a senior thesis on the role of women in the patriarchal society of the antebellum South. And I based my research on Princeton's extensive holdings in the manuscripts and published writings of the sons and daughters of the South. Thanks to this formative experience, I eventually went on to become an historian. A student's first encounter with archival materials can be, as it was for me, life-changing. And that is why the Radcliffe Institute is so committed to sharing the unparalleled resources of the Schlesinger Library as widely as possible, offering grants to students as well as to senior researchers to conduct research in our collections, and increasingly digitizing our most popular holdings to make them available worldwide. But archival materials do not tell stories by themselves. So we are especially fortunate to have Drew Gilpin Faust here today to help us understand these documents and the personal tales that they tell. Much of Drew's scholarship on the antebellum South and the Civil War period accomplishes just what the Schlesinger's exhibition sets out to do: to demonstrate how domestic documents are rich sources for understanding the broader societal changes sparked by political and military crisis. Drew's ability to connect the individual lives of men and women with the larger social and political forces that forever change those lives is one of her most impressive talents as an historian. Drew's biography of Southern planter James Henry Hammond, for example, composed a vivid portrait of a deeply complicated man from meticulous readings of his letters and diaries. She also used Hammond's detailed plantation records to reconstruct how enslaved African Americans sustained family ties against nearly all odds. Moreover, by linking Hammond's private life to his political and his intellectual ambitions, Drew provided a window into the complex psychology of the Southern master class. Drew's book on elite white women in the Confederacy, titled Mothers of Invention, examined the letters, diaries, and published writings of 500 Southern women. Because she paid such close attention to women's individual voices, Drew was able to explore the subtle ways that the Civil War caused women to rethink their identities as women and as Southerners. Most recently, Drew's magisterial study of death and remembrance in the Civil War, titled This Republic of Suffering, once again built an extensive analysis on the foundation of personal letters, diaries, and memoirs, among many other kinds of sources. The result is a stunning and compassionate account of how Americans' relationship to death was changed by a war where 1 in 4 soldiers did not return home. This Republic of Suffering won the Bancroft Prize in 2009 and was a finalist for the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize in History. Drew's book was also the basis for an Emmy-nominated documentary, Death and the Civil War, which was directed by Rick Burns and debuted in 2012 on PBS's American Experience. Drew Gilpin Faust is one of the nation's preeminent historians and was the Radcliffe Institute's founding dean. We proudly honored her last spring with the Radcliffe Medal for her contributions to Radcliffe, to Harvard, and to higher education. And so we are delighted that she is back again so soon with us, this time wearing her historian's hat to share her insights into the Schlesinger Library's Civil War collections. So now join me in welcoming our Harvard president, Drew Faust, to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz, for those very kind words, and thank you to everyone who conspired to invite me. The invitation was delivered by Nancy Cott in this room at a cocktail party some months ago, and I'm sitting there with my glass of wine. Of course, I said, of course. So here it is, at the moment of truth. and I'm delighted to have a chance to offer some perspectives on the exhibit and on the whole subject of the personal Civil War, what they wrote, what they saved. I come to this with the background of the work that Liz has described, and so I'll share with you some of the insights and dimensions of my insights into dimensions of Civil War writing and history making that I think this exhibit illustrates. The very title, the notion of a personal Civil War, indicates the way that this exhibit is a testimony to the revolutionary nature of our changed understanding of our Civil War past. We ask very different questions about the Civil War from the questions that an earlier generation of historians would pose. In my professional life as a historian, I have witnessed this revolution, moving from an attention to the Civil War that focused almost exclusively on generals and statesmen and broad national trends of political or economic import. A revolution that moved from that to an understanding of the war that, as Liz suggested, began to acknowledge that beneath these currents of power, there rested people, human beings, whose lives the superstructure of politics, of government, of economies depended on. And so we've come to see that to truly understand how the war unfolded, how people decided to fight or not to fight, to support a cause or not to support a cause, really rested in much more personal decisions. And that only by beginning to look at those questions could we begin to understand the war in its fullest form. Now, two streams of historical inquiry reinforced this transition, this revolution. One was the development of a new approach to military history, to the history of war. And this emerged most notably, if you want to take a timetable and say there's a particular moment, I would say 1974, when John Keegan's book, The Face of Battle, was published. This was a study of war that asked the question, what was the experience of the common soldier? What did he eat? When did he sleep? What did he believe? What made him fight? It focused on a series of battles in the space between Belgium and France over a number of centuries and posed this question over time in a way that made those who read this book realize there was a very different set of understandings that was necessary if we were going to explain why these soldiers all took up weapons and risked their lives and actually decided to go to war. And so with this book, military history began to shift significantly to ask questions about ordinary people, about personal dimensions of a wartime experience, and about the kinds of questions that we are asking today and that this exhibit asks today of the individuals whose papers and lives are represented within it. So that was one direction, one stream of change. A second came from what was called the new social history in my graduate school days. It's now pretty venerable. Hardly can be called new anymore. But this was a shift in history, once again, away from the obviously big and important figures, to look at the lives of enslaved people, to look at the lives of workers, and also to look at the lives of women and the ways in which ordinary experiences on the home front, in homes, in domestic settings, in family settings, were a critical aspect of our past. And so if we think of these two streams together, I think we can see how the kinds of materials in this collection of women, of ordinary people, simply writing back and forth about their lives are fundamental to our understanding of the Civil War. Now, the Civil War is a particularly rich site for exploring the convergence of these streams. So first of all, why would the Civil War be this valuable a focus? One is, it was a literate war. It was a war that took place at a time when the overwhelming majority of Americans could read and write. And that meant that ordinary people, pressed by the sense of historical circumstance, pressed by separations from one another, were moved and able to write down their thoughts, their dreams, their ideas, their experiences. And so that has been a critical part of the richness of Civil War historiography. It's a joy for a historian to see how many diaries, letters have been created and saved. Still many, I'm sure, in people's attics that we have not yet found, and that I hope you will all rush home and find and give to the Schlesinger Library. The Civil War was a written war. We see this in a wonderful way in the exhibit with the pencil and pen of a particular soldier who used it to create this record that now provides historians and all of us with the ability to understand something of what his experience entailed. Now, another aspect of this war that perhaps we don't acknowledge often enough is it was also an uncensored war. When we get to the 20th century, we begin to see things blacked out in letters or letters confiscated. No one had figured out how to do that yet in the Civil War. There was just a mass army that was so much bigger than anyone expected, so many people in the military, that I think even if somebody had the bright idea of wanting to censor, it would have been logistically next to impossible. So this war is a kind of unexpurgated and literate war, and both of those things are significant in the kind of record that has been left to us. Another aspect of the war that makes it an ideal focus of war in general, that makes war a really good subject for the new social history, is that war causes people to be apart. So things they would say to one another over the dinner table, they write down, and they put in letters that we can read. We don't know what people said to each other over the dinner table in 1861 or 1862. But we have these extraordinary records of what they wrote to each other because they were separated by the circumstances of war. So the intimacies of daily life, the descriptions of daily life, both by women saying what it was like at home and men describing, even drawing, as you saw in one of those slides, what the camp looked like, what their living conditions were like. This they do because they are parted from one another. Now, one of the things I began to recognize as I worked on my book about privileged Southern women, the one Liz described to you, Mothers of Invention, is that when you start to write things, you also go beyond describing sometimes. You're moved to say things that perhaps you would not put into words in ordinary circumstances. There was a statement by one young woman whose papers I read, Julia Davidson, who said to her husband, "We little knew how dear we were to each other until we began to feel we wanted to write that to one another in the context of separation." And so putting things into words makes people see their feelings in more explicit ways and articulate those feelings in more explicit ways. And so in some ways it changes the nature of relationships as words become the only vehicle for intimacies that might be expressed in other forms if people were in the same place and together. So we see wonderful examples of these kinds of exchanges. Royal Barry's description and sketches of camp life, his description of what he called an awful Thanksgiving at the front, women writing to their husbands about their daily experiences at home. But I was struck by how many men's letters there are in this collection. Case 4, for example, I think is mostly filled with men's letters, if I understood the descriptions right. I haven't had a chance to sort through entirely. And this is something that we should think about too in the what they saved department. What they saved, a part of that was what they were able to save. Another part was what they chose to save. It was much easier for a woman at home to save her husband's letters than it was for a man at the front to save his wife's letters, because he would be traveling around, he would be displaced, he would be moving. And so would he carry all those letters? Would they be preserved? it was more uncommon for that to be the case than for women at home to be able, just logistically, to save them. What did they choose to save? This, to me, is such an interesting element. There was such a sense among Civil War participants that they were living history, and that what they created in the way of documents were of lasting importance. And so we do see ordinary people who might throw out their letters or not think of them as valuable, when possible, endeavoring to preserve them so that their children would understand what they'd lived through, their grandchildren would understand what they'd lived through, history could understand what they'd lived through. Lewis Weld talks about treasuring and saving Nellie's letters, and Nellie dies, and then he dies, so we happily became part of that chain of custody. But the sense of commitment to preserving a relationship, a loved one, and a piece of history by preserving the documents is a very powerful one. So I've been talking so far about letters. This exhibition, and indeed the corpus of Civil War documents, also contains numbers of diaries and journals. And they, of course, represent as well a sense of history. Lots of people decided to keep diaries because they thought, hey, this is a big war and these are important times, and I, who never thought about keeping a diary before, want to record that. I want to remember it, I want to note it. And so we see an impetus towards diary and journal keeping that we are very much the beneficiaries of as we use these materials to patch together an understanding of what those Civil War years represented. One young Georgia woman, not in this exhibit, but one whose papers I read for my book, Mothers of Invention, observed that a journal rightly kept would also lead us to examine our hearts and profit from past infirmities. There's a kind of introspection that comes once you start to keep a journal. You define yourself as an important subject when you keep a journal. So this impetus of being a historian and recording history that women took up also shifted their perceptions of themselves, because they were now, in some sense, important historical actors whose lives were worthy of recording and worthy of note. And so there seems to me there is a kind of inevitable empowerment that derives from keeping a diary. It says you have something important to do and something important to say. Writing is inescapably an act both of self-discovery and of self-creation, as well as of simple description. So what were the functions of diary writing? I've just described one, recording important events. Another, I think, was an outlet for emotions. Many of these women were isolated, were alone, or were in situations with relatives. They were refugees. They were forced to live in circumstances that were not of their choosing. This was an outlet for emotions that might not be welcome if expressed in other ways. Sarah Morgan, a Louisiana woman whose papers I read, talked about her diary as a vent for her feelings. And she says, I get nervous and unhappy thinking of the sad condition of the country. And just before I reach the lowest ebb, I seize my pen, dash off half a dozen lines, and presto. Oh, what a resource that and all my books have been. I've seen numbers of women describe their diaries as silent friends, and some even give their diaries names, almost invisible playmates or visible playmates, as associates, as partners, as they move through these very difficult times. So to be chroniclers of history, or chronicles of diaries, chronicles of history, friends, venting, an opportunity for venting of feelings. These are all ways in which diaries served women and supported women at the same time that they gave women a sense of self-reflection and self-empowerment. But the library exhibit also reminds us that women's writing was not simply personal, and no one embodies that more fully than Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote, of course, what was the best-selling novel of the 19th century, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the famous though possibly apocryphal, remark by Abraham Lincoln that she was the little lady who caused this great big war. Here is a woman whose writing certainly empowered her and has made her an immortal figure in our historical consciousness. Women as writers and readers of novels were a phenomenon that stretched well beyond the Civil War. The Southern Literary Messenger in 1854 commented that women's novels were the characteristic literary effort of the present age. And of course, there's the disparaging remark by Nathaniel Hawthorne about all those scribbling women who were, in his eyes, I think, defiling the national literature with their production of novels. But if we think about what it meant for women to take up the pen to write in a public way, not just to write a letter or a diary, empowering as I've argued that writing a diary might be, here was an opportunity to reach beyond the home in a comparatively safe way. You didn't have to move your body outside the home. You moved your ideas and your words outside the home. And enable your imagination to transcend what your experience might have been. Uncle Tom's Cabin gave Harriet Beecher Stowe a political voice, a very powerful political voice. And to use the power of words, not just to find new selves, not just to scrutinize oneself through a journal or an unpublished diary, but rather to embrace a public role and to see how words could change a world, not just an individual. If we think about the subtitle of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Life Among the Lowly, I think we get a sense of one of the ways in which novel writing could change lives, both of those who were the writers and those who were the readers. First of all, the kind of empathy, life among the lowly. This was Harriet Beecher Stowe imagining the life and difficulties of slave families. The exhibit suggests that she, some of the correspondence in the exhibit suggests that she took this up because she was feeling such grief at the death of her own child that she wanted to understand how those in slavery who lost their children to sale or other hardships possibly could endure. And so in that act of empathy comes a foundation for change. And that was one of the great powers of the 19th century novel, that the empathy that it demanded led to a kind of humanitarianism that enabled people to escape their own domestic settings, their own local settings, their own identities, and understand the hardships and challenges that others faced. So in Uncle Tom's Cabin, we can see kind of the apogee of women's writing and the power that it involved. If we think about what they wrote, how they saved it and why they saved it, and then why the personal so clearly, to use the words of the women's movement of my youth, became political. The personal is very political in these writings, both in the way it changed individuals, but also in the way it was projected in the very dramatic example of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but in other published writing as well, projected into a world where women's voices began to have so much stronger an influence than had been the case in the past. So these documents, I think, do two things. First of all, they do many things, but two I'd like to emphasize. One is they're an extraordinary record of what a camp looked like, what Thanksgiving was like at the front, what it was like at home when your husband was gone and you were responsible for the economic welfare of your family. We can see all of that data, information, in the materials that these collections hold. But they also provide a sense of what writing meant and why it was such an important instrument of change and such an important force in its own right in this Civil War context for women in particular, but for individuals more generally. Warfare is, of course, about the power of guns, but I think we see in this exhibit how it was also about the power of words, and those words are ours still to understand, to read, to learn from. And I hope you really, really enjoy this wonderful exhibit. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Kathy Jacob. I'm Johanna-Maria Frænkel, Curator of Manuscripts at the Schlesinger Library. I grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and I grew up with very vivid stories of a wagon ride to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on July 5th, 1863. This is 2 hot days after the battle. So the Civil War has always been very real to me. When I and the committee, we were Northerners and Southerners, all eager to work on the exhibit, I think we can all attest to the fact that now the Civil War is even more real to all of us. Our first task when we started several months ago was to figure out first what the library had that spoke to the era of the Civil War. And it turns out we have quite a lot. We have diaries, we have hundreds of pages of letters, we have dozens of images, those are daguerreotypes, tintypes, cartes de visite, photographs. We have memoirs, autobiographies, biographies, histories of the war, and we have the very first fundraising cookbook, the Poetical Cookbook, published by women to raise funds for soldiers' relief. Then we had to decide what story to tell. We could have started with abolition, moved through the war into Reconstruction and the women's movement. We have plenty of material to do that, but then we thought better of trying to cover several decades and 7 small cases. We have material on the economic, political, and military history of the war years, but these are not our strengths. Our Civil War era material, we realized, best tells an intimate and personal story of the war. Our multi-generational collections, they're mostly Northern, the Beecher Stowe family, the Poors, the Foxes, the Ameses, the Blodgett Halls, they span the 19th century, and they include Civil War letters and diary entries that made us and may make you weep or laugh out loud. These are stories of fathers and sons and mothers and kid sisters and sweethearts, of women who nursed and taught and fought and organized to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars. These documents are glimpses into particular lives, and we know that no 2 lives are alike. But when selecting items to display, we looked for hooks, things on which to hang a bigger tale, objects that could be proxies for hundreds of other men and women in similar situations. And each one, we hope, opens a window that offers a wider view of the world. With every diary page we turned, every scribbled letter we tried to decipher, we were very aware that the only reason we had the privilege was because someone had chosen to save this piece of paper or this photograph. Some of the letters we've used came to us still tied up in a 150-year-old ribbon. A soldier's fragile comb was wrapped in paper. A photograph was tucked in the pages of a Bible. That mothers saved their sons' letters was moving, but that somehow an infantryman managed to hang on to letters from their mothers throughout the horrors of the Wilderness Campaign and bring them home safely was amazing. I'd like to tell you about a few of the saved items on display and that tell their own stories but stand in as stories for others. Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's a very famous writer, a prominent figure in her time, but she's also a mother and a woman whose son, whose nephews, half-brothers, and brother-in-law all served in the war. She worried about all of them, but especially about her son, Fred, who had been an alcoholic since he was a teenager. She wrote to her daughter, Hattie, in April 1861, "Ever since war was declared, I've been like a person struggling in a nightmare. Fred immediately wanted to go, but as a mere soldier, I felt he was not strong enough and might therefore only get sick and do no good. It's not that I would not give my son's life, but the temptations and dangers of the camp and the fears that sometimes will intrude of his being a prisoner among barbarians or wounded and helpless." In the fall of 1861, when Union forces took the Sea Islands of South Carolina, the first of nearly 1,000 teachers, most of them women, most of them New Englanders, headed south to teach newly freed slaves. And one of them who felt called to teach was Kathryn Porter Noyes, whose diary describes scenes and frustrations that must have been familiar to many others. Soldiers wrote home. They might send reassuring news of mending socks to their mothers and detailed accounts of battles to their fathers. Some filled their letters with doodles. We've seen some of them of their tents and of their fellow inmates. Some husbands sent wives reminders of debts to be paid, chores to be done, and fields to be plowed. Some sent seeds. Major Royal Barry sent his future wife, Nell, seeds that he gathered for her with a note that says, "What they are, I do not know." Albert Gallatin Brown was one of many men who hoped that his participation in the war would better his family financially. It didn't. He took a position with the Treasury in South Carolina, and his wife and daughters joined him there. Nellie immediately fell in love with Captain Lewis Weld, and then she died of typhoid. And her beloved Louis died 7 months after her. But their courtship letters speak to the transformative powers of love anywhere, anytime. Louis wrote to Nellie, "I am singing a song in my heart every hour in the day. I wonder at myself at the change you have made in me. I am a better man, a prouder, happier, stronger man because of my love for you." 3 out of 4 of Reverend Thomas and Farrelline Fox's sons enlisted in the war. The brothers wrote funny, lighthearted letters about camp life to their little sister, Fairy. "You had better believe there is no loafing here." They wrote more candid accounts to their father. And when son John died from wounds suffered at Gettysburg, there were letters that convey the burdens of death that all grieving families had to shoulder. Someone had to settle this soldier's debts. We have 2 very different women who wrote remarkable diaries that you'll find exhibited. And you can read them, and you can read transcriptions that Liz mentioned on the iPad in the exhibit. And I should tell you that the Beecher Stowe material that we have has been digitized, and it's accessible at home if you want. Please pick up one of these little cards if you see the exhibit, and it'll tell you how. So one of our diaries is Anna-Maria Davison's. She spent almost her whole life in New Orleans surrounded by the slaves her family owned. But in middle age, her careful reading of scriptures led her to very vocally repudiate slavery and the culture that was dependent on it. Only her family's prestige saved her from being tarred and feathered. Anne Reeves, who Liz mentioned, was a widow living comfortably in Delaware in 1861, but when her diary opens, she's leaving Yankee land for the South. She ardently embraced plantation culture and everything Southern. As the pages turn when she goes south, she hides the silver. She sews the jewelry into her skirts. And when the Yankee invaders do arrive at her doorstep, she doesn't hesitate to tell them just what she thinks of them. Okay, so maybe Davison and Reeves aren't representative of many other women, but they are really good stories that we just had to tell. So with Davison and Reeves and Harriet Beecher Stowe and Ensign Lewis Hunkins and Major Royal Pierce Barry and all of these women and men who wrote and saved material 150 years ago, all of this has the power to make the past more real, to open windows onto our shared history, and we hope that that's what the exhibit does for you. Thanks.